Hey there, MailQ readers, this is Lauren, and welcome to another episode of MQ. So this week I want to talk about what it's like to be gay in Japan as a foreigner. As some of you might already know, I lived in Japan about 4 years ago, and I went there as a language exchange student. And another thing is, this is really my experience in Japan as a foreigner, which is going to be a totally different experience than people who are actually born and raised there. You know, they have different family values, and they just have a lot of different things they have to deal with living as a permanent resident there that I probably didn't encounter. And also, this totally depends on where you live, what kind of environment you're in, whether you're working, you're in school, you're just there as a tourist. Your experience is going to be a lot different depending on your situation. Before I went to Japan for the first time, I kind of had this image of my mind as Japan as this magical land of anime and video games. And something about that kind of attracted me from when I was really young. One thing that I think a lot of people get wrong about Japan is it's not like what you see in video games, movies, or anime. Japan is a country just like any other place in the world. It has people who are just living their lives, going to school, going to work, and it's really not anything unlike something you'd find in Europe or the US. So now that we've brushed up on that, I want to talk about what gay dating life is like in Japan. Me and my boyfriend at the time, we actually met in the US, and I actually studied in his hometown, which is Kyoto. And part of the reason that I went there is because I wanted more of a Japanese style life, and Kyoto is known for being more traditional, there's not really as many foreigners, and it's much more of a slow-paced kind of city. So right off the bat, I already had a little bit of an idea of what to expect, because I had already been dating my ex-boyfriend for about a year, and I'd already been exposed to a lot of Japanese culture, food, and I kind of got a glimpse of the different kind of personalities that I would encounter when I lived there. So in this section, I really want to break it down into two different pieces, because I was in Japan for a year, and 6 months of that I was with my ex-boyfriend, and then 6 months of that I was actually single. So I got to see both the relationship side of what it's like to be gay in Japan, but also what it's like to be dating in Japan. One of the things that's really rare about Japan, especially compared to the US or Europe or other more progressive places, is that very few people are out of the closet and open with their family. So my boyfriend was actually 100% out to his friends and his family. I actually got to meet his mom and his dad, and I was actually able to go home with him for New Year's. And really the amount of kindness and the openness and the amount of hospitality that I got from his parents was absolutely unmatched. Every weekend I would go home with him to his parents' house, and his mom would make us dinner. I'd practice my Japanese with his dad and his sister, and they would actually let me stay there for the weekend. And from what I've heard from other people, this is pretty rare, but I had a really, really good experience with his family. Now, as far as how his parents felt about him being gay, I can't really say for sure, but in terms of how they treated me, I would say that things could not have been better. Now, unfortunately, about 6 months after I was living in Japan, my ex-boyfriend got a job in Tokyo, which is about 8 hours away, and he had a really, really busy work schedule, so we both decided that it was best for us to go our separate ways. So after that, I had about 6 months of being single in Japan, and at that time I met a few people, I dated around, and I got to get a little bit more of an idea of what it's like to be dating in Japan. So as far as meeting guys goes, probably the most popular way is using smartphone apps. So when I was in Japan about 4 years ago, the most popular apps were Jack.D and Grindr. Although if you wanted to use Jack, you pretty much had to speak Japanese because most of the guys were Japanese. There was very few foreigners. This was a huge first for me, not using my native language to communicate and go on dates with people. And I think the language barrier was really a challenge at first, but it really pushed me to make my Japanese better. And another thing about dating in a different language is you can kind of start to see the nuances and the different ways of thinking that people from different cultures have. So an example of this is in Japan, there's this habit of people don't really say what they're feeling, and it's more of an expectation that you understand their feelings just from knowing them as a friend. And when I was starting out dating, this was extremely difficult for me. One of the things that I really got used to growing up is talking about my emotions. And in Japanese culture, this is something that people just don't do. And so when I started dating, or even with my original boyfriend, I ran into a lot of problems where people would get angry, or they would think that I was rude, or just stop talking to me because I wasn't reading the social cues correctly. So if you can really keep this in mind when you're, meeting Japanese people, or you're living in Japan for the first time, this will totally come in handy and make your life a hell of a lot easier. In my second 6 months in Japan, I did start to date pretty seriously. And one of the things that really stood out to me was just how few people were actually out of the closet. And really, most of the guys that I met online were dating in secret and did not want anyone to know they were gay. I found that most people were just looking to date or just looking to hook up. So finding something serious, I would say, was even more difficult in Japan than it was back home. And another thing for me about dating that was really hard for me to get used to is the fact that in Japan, the idea of PDA, or public displays of affection, something as small as even holding hands, is something that you just will not see. So if you do by chance date someone in Japan, you're gonna have to keep this in mind. So as far as nightlife and a social scene goes, it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. So I could speak Japanese, so I had a pretty easy time, going to bars and clubs and meeting new people. But especially if you're in a smaller city like I was, if you don't speak Japanese, and you're gonna have a really hard time meeting new people. And one thing about Japan is that some of the bars are actually Japanese only, and they actually have signs on the outside saying that, no foreigners allowed. Now, this isn't a super common sight, and most bars do let foreigners in, but even still, if you're a tourist or someone who can't speak Japanese, I think you'll have an especially hard time, especially if you're not in a big city like Tokyo. And one of the other things I have to mention about Japanese clubs is that even if you're in a safe space where you know that everyone around you is gay, people are still very nervous. So for example, if I was having a conversation with someone in a gay bar and we brought up anything gay or anything about gay life, the conversation would be a little bit uncomfortable. And another thing about nightclubs that I found to be really shocking is that people don't dance. And I really think this has to do something with Japanese society, is people are not very outgoing, and you're really not supposed to stand out of the crowd. But for the most part, clubs in Japan are pretty low-key. Now, Tokyo, on the other hand, is a much different story. So this is probably the most international and diverse places in Japan, and therefore it's probably one of the most open and liberal places that you can go to. So Tokyo actually has its own gay district located in Shinjuku, but I have to say, the nightlife there was way better than what I experienced in Kyoto or Osaka. Now, as far as gay activities and events, my university did actually have a gay social circle, and we actually met probably once or twice a month. And from what I could tell, this is pretty common through most big universities, although I found that most of these groups are underground, so you might have to do a little digging if you want to go for the first time. So the next thing I want to talk about is my day-to-day experiences of being gay in Japan. So to start, I think that as a foreigner, life in Japan is a lot easier because as a foreigner, you kind of get a jail out of free card. Japanese people kind of expect you to be a little bit weird, and it's okay to be different. I have to say that life for me was pretty easy, but I can't really speak to what it's like to be gay as a Japanese person. And as far as people's reactions, I was pretty much out to everyone that I knew, my close friends, my classmates, my teachers. Everyone that I talked to took it really, really well, and honestly, it was more like my sexuality just wasn't important to them. So if I brought up that, I had a boyfriend, they might be like, huh? Do you mean a girlfriend? And I'd be like, no, I have a boyfriend. And, they would just maybe think for a bit, maybe ask a few questions, but then they would just go on their day like nothing had ever changed. And the way that they treated me was completely natural, and it was just like me being gay didn't really change my identity or their thoughts of me as a person. And honestly, I almost prefer this to the Western style, where sometimes it feels like when you come out, that's your defining characteristic, and once people know that you're gay, that's all they think of you as, is just the gay person. But in Japan, it was just like me being gay didn't really affect who I was, and people didn't treat me any differently. I wouldn't really say that Japan is an accepting society, or it's a really hateful society. It's more of some place in the middle where as long as you're doing your own thing, and you're not bothering anyone, people are just gonna let you live your life. So in the end, I'd have to say that there's a lot of really positive aspects of being gay and living in Japan, but there's also some drawbacks as well. And like I said before, this is just my own experience, so things might have changed a lot since I lived there last time, and depending on the city that you live in and the people that you meet, you could have something totally different. Now, would I want to live in Japan for the rest of my life? Probably not, because as far as marriage laws go and non-discrimination laws, Japan still has a long way to go. But as far as a place to travel or to go live and study, I would say that Japan's really not that bad. So guys, as always, I want to hear from you. So if you have your own stories or experiences living in Japan, please let us know in the comments below. And if you like this video, be sure to give us a thumbs up and subscribe down below. And if you want to see more videos like these, be sure to check us out at www.mailq.org. I'll see you soon.